Dear friends, hello everyone. I am Evgeny Kisilyev. I am live on my channel, and my interlocutor Vitaly Portnikov is also live, also on his channel. As usual, we do it every second. Every second Friday in parallel, we go on the air on 2 channels and talk about the most important, most interesting events of recent times. Vitaly, I am very glad to see you again. Greetings. Well, tell me please. What are your expectations from the next round of negotiations between the Russian and Ukrainian delegations? Perhaps it is still somehow unclear to the end, with the participation of some American representatives of Marco Rubio Davik. He said that neither Witkov nor Kushner would be there. And who will be, it is still unclear. But it seems that they are going to meet in Abu Dhabi on February 1st. And what's there? What's next? It seems to me that the very absence of both Turns and Kushner in these negotiations. It suggests that they have moved into a kind of technical nature. There are officials there, representatives of the intelligence communities in particular. Because we understand that the new head of the office of the President of Ukraine, he has been in charge for many years. The Intelligence Directorate of the Ministry of Defense, and there, on the other hand, the head of the main directorate of the General Staff of the Armed Forces of the Russian Federation is a former group. And it is clear that people of such qualifications can discuss 1,000 different details. But I believe that in any peace agreement, the main thing is not the details, but a political solution. Because officials can agree on any details among themselves without actually advancing the main goal. I have repeatedly said that I believe that the very absence of an agreement on a truce before holding negotiations is already an indicator of the Russian president's unwillingness to make peace. And the negotiation process itself can go on indefinitely in such a situation. I didn't really understand why, and I don't understand why Donald Trump agreed to Putin's scenario after Anchorage. That is, first a peace treaty, and then a ceasefire. Although, according to the whole logic of the process, it should be exactly the opposite. And all the same, now, as we see, even within the framework of this sluggish peace process, Trump is trying to get Putin out of it. Some kind of partial truce in certain sectors. Now they are saying that an energy truce was allegedly reached. But we don't know if that's the case. We can assume that this is not an energy truce for a week, but the time Russia needs to accumulate new arsenals. Drone missiles for new massive strikes on Ukraine after this pseudo-truce expires. It can also be the same. Because if this is an energy truce, it means that Russia has not been hitting Ukraine's energy infrastructure for a week, as Trump said. Meanwhile, Ukraine can strike at Russian oil refineries. And if Ukraine has the arsenal to hit the Russian oil industry, and Russia does not have the arsenal now to continue its attacks, it turns out that Ukraine gives Russia the opportunity to take a break for a week to accumulate the necessary weapons and strike again. At the same time, it will be considered that there was a certain constructive. Well, what can I say? Again, I'm not saying that. But many military experts say this, but I won't. This is to assert. But nevertheless, all these are not agreements at all. All of this is in fact, so far, exclusively this kind of walking in a circle. Listen, I have a question for you. That is why Putin launched such a brutal campaign right now, at the end of last year, at the beginning of this year. Such a massive campaign of strikes with missiles and drones, primarily with ballistics of course, on the objects of the Ukrainian energy infrastructure. After all, he could have done it before, he could have done it in 2022. After the first episode with the explosion on the Crimean Bridge. He could have done it in 2023. I honestly don't really understand. Why do you think he did? There were constant massive attacks. There was no such scale. No, there was no such scale. It was such a scale, there were no such results. It is not necessary to confuse all the same again. Scale with the result. There were massive attacks, there were blackouts, excuse me, when the cities were plunged into complete darkness. I remember it very well. I also wrote a text about it, as if in full. In the complete darkness of Lviv, when nothing worked at all, do you understand? It was completely dark, there was practically no even a glimmer of light, no electricity was working in the city. He was in the dark. It was the winter of 2023 to 2024. No, 2000, yes, 2020 to 2023, right. There's December 20th 22, February 20th 23, 2020 to 2023. That was a complete lockout. Everyone was still amazed at how it was possible to shoot with such cruelty, to disable entire cities. But this all has a cumulative effect. We are just witnesses of the cumulative effect. Nothing new is happening at all. Every winter. Cumulative effect plus severe frosts. Plus the cold. There were no previous winters. Don't you think there's another factor? What? Putin finally felt his impunity and stopped. It means that this is the first winter with Donald Trump. This is not only the first winter with Donald Trump, but also, I would say, the first winter when it became obvious. It is obvious how much political will the European leaders also lack. Well, it's all possible, but I say it again, we must understand that the strikes are being carried out on the Ukrainian energy industry, which has already been virtually destroyed in previous years. To assume that there was energy, and these attacks disabled it, means not to understand what happened before. All this was kept on my word of honor, it was patched up and patched up. Again, in fact, there is nothing catastrophic with the Ukrainian energy sector. It doesn't happen because nuclear power plants are working. And if you ask whether Ukraine has enough nuclear power plants in its current economic situation, even when the Zaporozhye one does not work, of course, it is enough. There is no overflow. Yes, the main task of the Russian army all these years was to destroy the overflow and those thermal power plants that could work without communication with nuclear power plants. That's it. This is a very simple task, it is not political. It's just impossible to execute it quickly. And, by the way, if you remember, I have always said that the sooner we end the war, the more opportunities there will be to preserve economic resources. It's not by chance that I say that every new year, wars are a road to the abyss every time, because it seems to everyone that the war goes on and on. No. If we take energy resources, let's imagine that now, let's say, we have reached some kind of conditional truce, although I don't believe it. I mean energy. And in the winter of 2025 to 2026 or 2026 to 2027, yes, there will be new blows. Let's imagine, because it has already been destroyed. Something now will be repaired, any station, transmission of ATS will start to work, some energy will appear with a 10-hour blackouts. And a year later hit again. Do you understand? And it may simply not be restored. No repairs will help anymore. A war of this kind has a cumulative effect. The longer it lasts, the greater the threat of the Lebanese situation. This is reality. And yes, of course, Putin can act more now. Decidedly, because he believes that he will not be answered. But again, he had acted less decisively before. I want to say one more thing. We don't have enough air defense right now. And again, everyone also knew that something like this. Why? Because the production of missiles and drones by the Russian Federation, with an increase in production every year, every month, with the complete transfer of the Russian economy to the rails of the military-industrial complex. Faced with the fact that there are simply not enough anti-missiles. Even if we assume that Ukraine would have been supplied with everything that is needed and on time, there would still not be enough anti-missiles to deter Russian strikes. And it wasn't like that before. There weren't so many missiles in Russia. I dare to remind you that, let's say, the production of the same missiles for the Patriot complexes is limited. If my memory does not change, 650 missiles is the annual capacity. Producing these same missiles of the military industry of the United States. They cannot produce more than 650 missiles yet, and a significant part of these missiles goes primarily to Israel, the largest consumer. He's a patriot, as far as I understand. Yes, but we still need to leave the children. We still need to give the Europeans, right? We need to give more to the Europeans. And now imagine that Iran, as a result of some further convulsions of Trump, will launch another missile attack on Israel. And how many Patriot missiles will Israel spend in order to repel this strike together with the Americans? How many new missiles will he need after such a massive attack? After all, even huge attacks. And Israel has such a situation that if it does not recapture something, it may lose some city there. It's a small country, unlike Ukraine. There, if a massive attack flies, it ends in success, then this can lead to catastrophic destruction. Well, here's the answer to the question. By the way, we're talking about Iran. Do you think we should wait for the start of the United States operation against Iran? Or has Trump backed down? You know, it's very difficult to understand this for one simple reason. He may or may not have backed down, but the most important thing is that not a single American operation, and this, by the way, is also something that inspires optimism to Putin, is currently not related to the specific use of armed forces. It is related to the effect of missile attacks. Here we are going to make a rocket bombing. Maybe we will kill someone, disable someone, and thus everyone else will be forced to negotiate with us. And it is better that they agree with us before the bombing. But this does not work in a number of cases. Well, we can assume that this conditionally worked in Venezuela. Although, again, the regime has been preserved, it is maneuvering, it can expect that at some point, American attention to Venezuela will weaken. Here, if you keep the power, all the opportunities, all the resources, then, of course, you have a lot of chances to maneuver. Especially if you have other partners, such as Russia and China. It's the same situation with Iran. Well, let's assume that Trump. He will conduct an operation, launch missile strikes on the so-called decision-making centers, kill several leaders of the Islamic Republic and the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. And what? How will the regime destroy it? If he controls the situation in the country, the regime is destroyed according to the Iraqi principle, which, so don't like Trump. A large regular army is being introduced, an occupation regime is being established. This occupation regime provides a transitional period, free elections are held. Power passes to people who are elected by the population, and there are chances that these people will be able to create a different type of state, although in Afghanistan these chances were not crowned with success, but were crowned with the fact that American troops had to leave the country and, in fact, give power to those with whom they fought. In other words, there was a military defeat. So, well, Vitaly, do you imagine the size of Iran? I represent the configuration of Iran. I believe that the United States cannot do this. Therefore, again, all of Trump's threats are not without reason, because the United States cannot do much. I agree with you. I represent the size of Iran. I represent the economic size of Russia, let's say, from the point of view of the regime's survival. I understand perfectly well that the most important thing for Trump is not to expose the Americans' lack of real tools to change the situation in the world fundamentally. That we are approaching the moment when many will understand not what Trump does not want, and the fact that he can't. And he can't, not because he's Trump, but because he's the President of the United States. And the person in this position is limited in opportunities. Here. So this is a very serious problem. Yes, I would just like to remind you, dear friends, just not everyone knows. It's also the fault of old Mercator. The fact is that modern geographical maps are based on we call the ancient Mercator projection, which, unfortunately, distorts the size of countries and continents a little in our perception. So, the territory of Iran is 1,600,000 square kilometers, even more. It is almost the whole of Western Europe, relatively speaking, from the Atlantic to the border of Poland with Germany. Imagine what kind of territory it is, and the population there is about 90 million people. This cannot be compared with Iran, Kuwait, Iraq, or any other country, where the Americans and allies have conducted successful ground operations in the past. There are no possibilities for such an operation here. But, Vitaly, after all, let's remember the events of the 12-day war last summer. After all, there was a moment when, in fact, Israeli aviation established complete air supremacy over Iran, after just a series of American precision missiles blows, and they were there, you could say, doing whatever they wanted. No, I'm not arguing, it's possible. It is impossible. It is possible to destroy military power. It is impossible to destroy the regime. That's what we're talking about. So you don't believe in an opportunity? Well, and if the Americans are an opportunity for change, I mean, well, suppose the Americans take it and conduct some kind of operation similar to the abduction of Madurov, they will take it somewhere. Stolen or just eliminate Ayatollah Khamenei. Another supreme leader will be elected, a new government of the country will appear. This is an ideological state. Well, here are experts on Iran. I myself was once professionally engaged in Iran, but now I no longer pretend to be a role experts. This is, let's say, my previous profession, but I still have a lot of familiar specialist Zionists. They say that there is, as they say, a leadership vacuum. There is no equal replacement to this supreme Ayatollah himself. After Stalin's death in March 1953, there was also a leadership vacuum in the Soviet Union. If the system persists, the leadership is then found. The question is whether they can destroy the system. The leadership vacuum, if you remember, on March 5, 1953. The year was 100%. Which one of Malenkov is the leader? Who was the leader there at all? Berry, who claimed to be the leader, was assassinated a few weeks after Stalin's death. That's the whole story of the leadership vacuum. It's the same here, practically. And by the way, when Ayatollah Khamenei was dying, they also talked about the leadership vacuum of the Iranist. Who could be similar, who could really replace this Khamenei? Yes, there was no such person. Then, by the way, some of Ayatollah Khamenei's closest associates were alive, and they did it on purpose. They chose Khamenei, who was considered not the strongest among the founders of the Islamic Republic. In other words, they deliberately went to the point of appointing not the influence itself, not the most domineering person. He even has it on the video of his speech, then in which he, addressing the members of the council that was supposed to elect him, asked not to do it, because, they say, far from being the most authoritative, not the most influential theologian among you, but Ali Akbar Haysamirov Shinzani, one of Khamenei's closest associates. which was also there. At one time, the Iranian president said, like, enough is enough, there is no need for unnecessary words, let's vote. Just literally gagged him. He was chosen. And then, again, we know from our history, it happens that a not very strong person who has become a leader begins to consolidate power in an amazing way in his hands. By the way, Brezhnev also appeared in a certain situation of implicit leadership. It just shows that all the talk about the leadership vacuum is very conditional, because leadership is largely communicated by the position. In 2000, Russia also had a leadership vacuum in many ways. No one understood how serious Putin's positions were. It's not even possible to tell now. By the way, do you imagine that Putin really is? He negotiates with Trump about some kind of truce, promises him something there, or just leads by the nose. I didn't quite get it. Here you believe that all these people who are talking to Trump, there is some kind of Putin, Delcy Rodriguez, maybe some Iranian. The officials who allegedly talk to Trump through his staff, President Pezeshkian, that's what they really promise Trump. Putin truce, Delcy raise oil, Pezeshkian rejection of the nuclear program in one form or another. What are they saying all this, or is it all going on in Trump's head, talking to them? Or does he misunderstand their signal? Here it is very important to understand what is really going on. Did you pay attention to what Fico, the Prime Minister, said after the meeting with Trump? Slovakia, which is certainly not his vociferous opponent, drew attention to this leak, which took place a few days ago, when Fitz, according to those present, at the same time, European diplomats said that it was at the EU summit, and he communicated with several leaders of EU countries, that he was extremely alarmed by the psychological state of Donald Trump, with whom he met in the estate of his estate at Mar-a-Lago in Florida, and his condition, Fico said, is alarming because it should be feared. That is, the hint was that he was inadequate. Well, I quite believe that. Moreover, as you know, it was a very strange meeting. Trump did meet with the Slovak Prime Minister at his estate in Florida. And this meeting was closed to journalists. By the way, Fitz never explained why, actually. After all, Trump, who loves journalistic questions so much at meetings that can demonstrate how much he loves Fitz, or how much he is loved in Europe, yes, Fitz would certainly play along with him. No one at all. He didn't invite me there. What was the reason for the closeness of the meeting with the Prime Minister of Slovakia? And why did the Prime Minister of Slovakia come out of there dumbfounded? This is also a good question. When he talks about Trump's condition, Trump probably said something to him and offered something that twits could not perceive. Take it seriously. The facts are important, not the characteristics of the psychological state. Maybe he confused Slovakia with Slovenia, and that led to fits. Well, it's not a psychological state. So many American presidents have done, I must say. You remember that very well, too. Well, I'm kidding. Yes, I could have mixed it up, but it also means a little. So yes, I agree that Trump is in a difficult situation, but his desire to live in his own reality is also not new. It was traced, perhaps not in such volumes, but during Trump's first term as president. The United States. Well, after all, I have a feeling that Trump has passed back. No. Passed in the sense of his psychophysical state. Yes, his opponents can use it. Just like Biden of the 2020 model, when he just won the presidential election, and Biden of the 2024 model. Agree, these are two completely different Bidens. His, let's say, psychophysical decline of the previous US president was visible to the naked eye. Because you and I know perfectly well, again, We have seen it in the near future for a number of people. That being president of any state, especially such as the United States, is a constant terrible physical stress. And this is due not only to your state of health, that you have something with your organs, relatively speaking. But this is a state of mind when you make the hardest decisions, and in the end, if you are either in poor physical shape or in old age. But it's all starting to take its toll quickly. Well, here I can't help but say. And look at Vladimir Zelensky, how he has changed over the 4 years of the war. Of course, but he's a young man. Do you understand? He's not that young, he just recently turned 48, 48. 48, not 80, you know. 48, not 80, but also not a boy anymore. Of course, I'm not arguing, but again, there are many examples of this kind. When a person seems to be 75 minus 77 years old, there comes to the post of head of state. And then it's impossible to recognize him after 2 years. Yes, it is clear that if this is some kind of ceremonial position, that does not require constant inclusion in big politics. Here were the elderly presidents of Italy. Now Sergio Mattarella, he is not a very young man, to put it mildly, he is also far over 80 there. I'm not even talking about Luigi Napoleon. But they calmly fulfilled this position, because it required from them, let's say, wisdom and protocol. You are not forced to think every 10 minutes with trembling hands, what to do with this, with this. There will be new problems with this. These documents are not. You are performing some, in fact, monarchical duties, the duties of a constitutional monarch in the Republic. It can withstand at any age. Well, yes. You remember that Elizabeth II, she is before the shift, received the Prime Minister Listras actually the day before his death. Well, this, of course, is also the courage of the individual, but nevertheless, it is possible. Imagine running a government at that age in that condition. Well, and the current King of Great Britain, Charles III, is also not a young man at all. Yes, but these are other responsibilities. And Trump is not a monarch, that's the point. He may perceive himself as a constitutional monarch, but he is, in fact, both the president and the prime minister in one person. Can lead the government. No one else who can lead. There is no government administration in terms of functionality. Well, by the way, here you are talking about Vladimir Zelensky. Vladimir Zelensky also leads Ukraine in the same way. In fact, he cannot delegate authority due to, I would say, his own idea of power. Therefore, of course, when so much responsibility and such a burden falls on you, then you begin to change quite quickly. But again, I say again, under 50 is one thing, under 80 is another. So I agree. And by the way, tell me, now that Zelensky has a new head, the office has a new defense minister. Do you feel any changes? I don't feel it. In any case, all decisions are made by the first person. This is such a formed system of power. I think that maybe the previous head of the office could unload Zelensky to a greater extent than in the current one, because, probably, in the previous head of the office, he personally could trust more than the current one. Although, again, we don't know that. This is a hermetic regime of power. It's probably a little too early to judge Kirill Budanov as the head of the office. Well, of course, especially since he was engaged in a completely different functionality. And again, the question is that each head of the office takes on as much power as he wants on himself, you know. In the same place, the functions are not really defined. You can run an office, or you can run an office, parliament, government, and even the armed forces. On this fact, it is conditional to lead, again, being a transfer link between all these structures and the head of state. Because I still insist that in Ukraine, all decisions were made by the head of state in this system. But again, the scope of the head of the office's capabilities in terms of intermediary chances. That's a good question. What do you think? Different versions are expressed in this regard. The appointment of Kirill Budanov, a man who, as some claimed, had presidential ambitions, is a kind of plan for the further transfer of power. In other words, there can be no transfer of power in a country like Ukraine. There are no objective circumstances. that spoke about the possibility of holding presidential elections at the moment. As the head of the main development department, you have much more opportunity to be a public figure. I mean perceived as a representative of the army, rather than in a bureaucratic position, and so on. So I don't think it has anything to do with it at all. Perhaps this is a search for a person who could really somehow smooth out the consequences of the whole scandal that the president's office. I am interested in your assessment. Budanov had, in your opinion, presidential ambitions. I believe that any person in power can have presidential ambitions, but during the war it doesn't matter, because when the war ends, it will end sometime, the whole political scene will look completely different. Do you understand? War is darkness. When the hostilities end, the sun will rise, and it will turn out that everything looks completely different. And until the sun rises, there is absolutely no need to understand this topic. That's why I always say, do not read opinion polls, do not be interested in how the population will vote today. Everything will be completely different. And many people who now have a rating of 5-10% can get 50% in 2 months after the end of the war. And those who have 50% will have 5-10%. In other words, there will probably be a complete reset of the political elite. A complete reset of public sentiment. The reset of the political elite may not even be more than that. The elite that was before 2019 may remain, but it will simply change the configuration. Maybe anything. Again, it depends on many reasons, on the conditions for ending the war, on what the economic situation will look like after the end of the war, on guarantees of security as people. People will feel themselves. It depends on the composition of voters, how those who are only on the territory of the country, or those who are abroad, will participate in the elections, too, and in what quantities, do you understand? All of this is completely unknown. You don't believe in the specific figures of opinion polls. Nevertheless, can you judge at least approximately about the mood in Ukrainian society? No, I can't. Ukrainian society is very differentiated. I never judge the mood in society at all, because I always risk making a mistake. I never know anything about public sentiment. I'm not an expert on public sentiment. When, let's say, Ukrainians. I proceed from the fact that the average Ukrainian literally has porridge in his head. Always. That's it. Yes. This is generally a property of the post-Soviet space, especially in a democratic country. Here the Russians have porridge in the head, they just have more confidence in what they hear from the government. Ukrainians have never traditionally trusted the authorities to draw any conclusions of their own, depending on the situation in which they find themselves at this particular moment. Therefore, I do not know about public sentiment. I have no doubt that sociology largely shows the unwillingness of Ukrainians to capitulate to Russia. But what's next? These are completely different ideas about the future. Well, why am I asking this question? I've just been talking to the professor. Paniota, Vladimir Paniota, you know. Yes, he is a major sociologist, of course, but he is engaged in the sociology of war. For me, I don't even read these numbers. No, well, he says that her latest research shows that it doesn't matter, despite all the sacrifices, all the difficulties, all the destruction, everything that the Ukrainian people have to go through now, the majority of Ukrainian citizens are against any compromises. Well, that's what I'm telling you, that's the way it is. But that's what it is. You agree with that? This is sociology. I do not know if this is true. I believe that when people answer the questions of sociologists, they want to look decent in such conditions. And they may not betray their true thoughts even to themselves. That is, they give the desired answer, the so-called desirable for themselves, not for sociologists. I understand. This is a well-known phenomenon. Yes. And that's why we don't know about the real public sentiment. And we'll never know, because that's what it looks like. It is very important for a person to survive the war, to hold on with dignity for himself. Most people behave like that. There are other people, of course, but they are always in the minority during the war. Always. But when the war ends, it turns out that this minority, which did not want to behave with dignity, is joined by a huge number of people who believe that it is already possible to behave differently. The main danger has already passed. And this is the majority, which then leads to an electoral shock. That's it. Therefore, I say again, I am completely uninterested in what people are saying to sociologists now. I was even told by some of my acquaintances about how they saw their friends or relatives there, answering a question from sociologists on the phone. Straightening up, I'd say. And then they walked away from the phone and told them completely opposite things that just scared them. But that's okay, say it again, even here people don't need to blame. It is a person who has a sense of self-worth. He is not going to tell someone else, I want to capitulate. No, he doesn't want to, you know. But if someone makes a decision for him, he will make it. Here it is important how many people, let's say, would not accept the decision to surrender if the authorities wanted to accept it. Although we understand that the authorities, fortunately, do not want this, and will protest against this decision. This is an important figure. By the way, again, you can ask people this question, they will also tell you that they will protest. What matters is not what they say, but what happens. Do you understand? In that case, you, Vitaly, can't tell me, for example, what the reaction will be. The military defending these last ones. No, I can't, because I think I know that kind of thing. If these 5,000 square kilometers, suddenly under pressure from the Americans, Europeans, I don't know who, the Chinese, Zelensky will be forced to. I don't think he's going to do it. And moreover, I believe that even if he agrees with this, other conditions will be put forward. That will still have to help Putin continue the war. Which ones, for example? I don't know, Putin can come up with anything. Now he will demand to fix that there will be no NATO troops in Ukraine. Or something else, he'll come up with, I'm sure for him. Well, tell me in your opinion, are there any valid security guarantees that could ensure state independence? National sovereignty, inviolability of Ukraine for many decades. Nowadays, there are no guarantees of security at all. No one. The only guarantee of security until recently was the 5th article of NATO, that is, the readiness of the United States to take direct part in an armed conflict if any country will attack an ally, and thus actually create the conditions for a nuclear winter. Because we don't know if this article works, and whether the United States is ready to defend its European allies. Moreover, the United States hints that it is ready to violate Denmark's sovereignty, as President Trump says, by military means. He didn't rule it out. Do you remember how Putin once did not rule out an attack on Ukraine? We don't know if the 5th article of NATO works. Therefore, there are no guarantees of security in the modern world. And all the talk about security guarantees that Ukraine and the United States are discussing now is rather a protocol decision. I believe that the only real guarantee of security for Ukraine is a strong Ukraine itself. In other words, Ukraine has such a large number of weapons, missile armies, and potential that will allow it to destroy most of Russia's territory in the first hours after Russia's attack on Ukraine, and thus minimizes the effect of a possible nuclear strike. Russia in Ukraine. If Russia understands that it has such a strong state in front of it, it will refrain from aggression. If Russia knows that in the event of an attack on Ukraine, it is not in danger, Ukraine itself will not cause decisive damage to it, and the United States will not interfere in the conflict, but will deliver the maximum. If Ukraine has any more weapons, as it was before, then there will be no guarantees that the war will not happen again. That's it. Because everything is very simple and logical. But a strong Ukraine is a real guarantee of security. The question is whether Russia will agree to end the war if it is ensured that he will never be able to attack Ukraine again. Russia will try to disarm Ukraine. And not to arm, right? Absolutely. There you go. Absolutely. And you admit that Putin can use nuclear weapons against Ukraine. At the moment, do not allow it, because I do not see any reason or need for this. He does not understand how the entire international situation will change in the event of the use of such weapons. And there is no need for him now. He does not understand how the attitude will change. With Trump and Xi Jinping and since, well, used nuclear weapons. Then what? When he is actually trying a humanitarian catastrophe without nuclear weapons. Well, then why are Western leaders so afraid of this? Because the conflict of a nuclear state is one thing, with non-nuclear, but another thing. The conflict of nuclear states is not the same thing. A direct conflict of nuclear states, pregnant with the exchange of nuclear strikes. There is such an opportunity. In other words, Putin will not use nuclear weapons in Ukraine, but let's say in Europe, which, as some politicians suggest, will try to arrange a complete blockade, for example, of this most notorious shadow tanker fleet. Here it can use nuclear weapons on them. No, in the case of a real direct military conflict, not because of the tanker fleet. If there is a direct military conflict, it is immediately unknown who will use nuclear weapons first. If Russian actions threaten, let's say, some American military facilities, the very existence of the countries that are allies of the United States, we do not know who will be the first to use nuclear weapons in this case. This is a situation that is unpredictable. No, well, you remember, not the last person, as they say, in the Russian political elite, or, let's say, in the Russian political science elite, serving the Kremlin, Sergei Karaganov. Yes, it scares Europeans with nuclear weapons all the time. They propose to use nuclear weapons in order to demonstrate Russia's readiness to use them. Yes, and absolutely. But again, no one in the Russian leadership knows the consequences of these actions, right? Moreover, I think it was quite clearly stated under Biden what the military technical consequences would be. And under Trump, it is no longer said. We don't know. This is all confidential conversations. And then, you know, under Trump, there is no need to talk, because no one knows how it will be. Trump is acting. Trump's unpredictability is an important ally here. And it's hard work to drag a hippopotamus from the swamp. It's right there. About communication outside world with Mr. Trump. And Mr. Putin, especially, by the way. It is still unknown who is more difficult to communicate with. Why do they love each other? I don't think they love each other. I don't think Putin likes Trump. Excuse me. I don't see any feelings here. He constantly laughs, teases, mocks. It's not love. And Trump may like some, so to speak, Putin's qualities as a strong leader. But he again sees these qualities not only in Putin himself. He even admired Xi Jinping and Kim Jong-un when he saw how they expressed his assistance. Trump loves strong power, not Putin personally. And Putin doesn't particularly like Trump. It seems to me that he despises him. Zairit. Yes. Because Putin is in Trump's place, he would have acted. It would be completely different with Putin. Much more harshly and decisively. Do you understand? Putin did not hesitate. Don't you think that Trump is breathing unevenly to Putin? He likes Putin. Like any authoritarian strong leader. Putin is not alone here. I say again, he liked Kim Jong and liked him. Why go far? He liked him. He sympathized with Orban. He sympathizes with everyone who shows authoritarian qualities in one way or another. Because he might have wanted to be like that sometime in his youth, I don't know if he wants to now. Nobody knows that. Alas. Alas. And what about Greenland? What do you think? A break? A break, or will Trump ride this topic again? It's all possible. We don't know how it will happen in the future. Again, if this has already been approached once, then it is possible to approach it again. We are in a state of complete uncertainty with you in all critical issues of policy development. This is also a fact of the first year of Trump, which will be now. This is the second year we have been in such a world. Well, after all, a lot depends on what is happening in the United States itself. Yes, of course, by-elections, how Trump would like to look at these by-elections, whether it is important for him to calm down some crisis statements or strengthen them, we will find out over time. I'm not even talking about the fact that unprecedented frosts in the United States, too, and half of America was covered with snow. And God knows what's going on. Minnesota was almost on the verge of civil war. Yes, in other words, it turns out that any domestic political mistake can lead to a shock. Yes, the administration is starting to see this too. And then, after all, Trump actually had less. I don't know if you agree with me or not. But consider that 2028 will have to be deleted from his presidency. Because everything there will be subordinated to the election campaign, and everyone will already be wondering who He will be the first candidate of the Republican Party. J.D. Vance and Marco Rubio will probably meet there. Well, yes, that's why they're both trying, so to speak, to knock each other out of the saddle. Well, not so much Rubio's Vance, but Rubio's Vance with his actions. And who are you betting on? I don't know yet. I'm not ready to look that far. It's difficult with the Democratic Party there, but it can also be more difficult with the Republican Party than we think. Let's see. Do you think there might be something dark horse to jump? I admit anything under the current conditions. In other words, Vitaly Portnikov's forecasts for the victory of someone in the 2028 elections in America are still a long time to wait. For a long time, though, because I have to understand how the situation in the American economy will develop, what Trump will do with it. Until 2028. Will he even give a Republican the opportunity to win? And how do you think the situation in the Russian economy will develop? Do you follow this? I'm watching, but we also can't predict a lot because we have limited information. Yes, but you have noticed that many economists, who in principle consider themselves to be oppositionists who live in political exile, have been saying for a long time that they are not. But still the Russian economy. She held the test of sanctions, that she adapted to the conditions of the war, the isolation of Russia began to grow. And now, literally at the end of last year, at the beginning of this year, they began to say so carefully, so cautiously, that perhaps our estimates were slightly overestimated, too optimistic. That now the trend is rather defeating pessimistic assessments regarding the future of the Russian economy. Yes, I saw that. But again, we don't know how right they were then, and how right they were now. Well, relatively speaking, whose position do you find more convincing? More convincing are those who say that he underestimated the possibility of a failure of the Russian economy. Well, Vitaly, I know that you are in a hurry today, that you need to go somewhere, so let's finish this. Thank you so much for this conversation. My friends, let me remind you, we are live on 2 channels. In parallel with Vitaly Portnikov, we had our next conversation. We meet every other Friday. And we ask you not to forget about subscribing to our channels, to my channel Evgeny Kisilyev, and to Portnikov's Arguments channel. And, of course, keep in mind, if you didn't connect to our conversation first, in just a few minutes, this video will be posted on Vitaly's channel and on my channel. There you can look at it first, review it, and please, continue to react at the same time. Likes, questions, comments are all welcome. And I draw the attention of those who live in Russia, who watch us from the Russian Federation. There is an opportunity to purchase my VPN service, a weapon to combat Roskomnadzor's blockages. All the details are in the description of this video. That's it for me. If you, Vitaly, have nothing to add, then have a good trip. Thank you. Everything?